And we're back. Money can fix some problems. One thing I forgot to mention in the recordings on the syllabus is that I encourage you to, but don't require you to look at my Facebook page, which I also mentioned in the letter I sent out. It's completely open. Friending is not necessary. This is my current thread. Often at the beginning of a lecture, assuming there's been at least a day since I recorded my last one, I'll go in here and try to find out whether there's something that's relevant to the course, and usually there is. And I must confess that at the top is a cartoon I find delightful, which I often post. And First Friday is today, and that's exciting. And this too is the cartoon I like. Little politics. I'm not very mystical, and we have a candidate running for president who kind of is. The author of my fundamentals textbook and behavioral neuroscience posted this link, which I've looked at. And as we get deeper in the course, we'll see traditional and evolving methods for treating depression and anxiety. And ketamine has been sort of in the shadows for quite a while. And by the end of the course, you'll know quite a bit more about it. This person's experience with ketamine is positive, but not overwhelmingly positive. It didn't turn out to be magical. She did not use the new nasal spray yet. She was getting injections. But for some people, ketamine seems to be very helpful for depression and anxiety. Politics. Apparently, honeybees had a very, very bad winter. I hope we figure out what's going on there. This is pretty exciting. It's not psychopharmacology, but it's certainly relevant to health. They have been able to eliminate HIV infections in some, but not all mice, and they may start trying it in humans. This could be big. I'm a big cell phone user, but this is a U.S. study, even though it was reported in the BBC, that undergraduates who use mobile phones heavily, lower grades, drinking problems, and more sexual partners. By the way, I like the Oxford comma. So since this is a list of 3 or more things, I would like it to be comma and rather than just open. What else? Oh, this is interesting. Bladder cancer, and they've been able to utilize the cold virus to destroy or help destroy bladder cancer. Some of my peers work on neuroregeneration. This is not classically that, but surgeons, I think in Australia, are rewiring paralyzed limbs and regaining function. The seaweed bloom goes completely across the Atlantic Ocean. Electric may not save us. Reflux drugs, the proton pump inhibitors, there are some negative outcomes in people of your age range, and I didn't realize they were giving some of these things to children, very young children, and there seems to be an association between these drugs and bone fractures. Not good. This is an interesting article about emotional intelligence. I really like SciShow, and this is Show Psych. Their episodes are often extremely relevant to psychology and neuroscience. In this, and not too much this one for psychopharmacology, however. And there's another one of the cartoons, and I think I'm about politics, uh, ranking the healthiness of eating beast. That was moving for me, the Declaration of Independence, and there they are again. I love that strip. And I don't know if you've been exposed to Schoolhouse Rock, but that's a great little segment on the Declaration of, or just independence from England. And this is what the 4th of July was about. And I think I'm about, this is a drug, but it's a tainted drug, tainted alcohol. Alcohol is not the best drug, and when you taint it, it gets even worse. This is exciting. Small entrepreneurs are getting involved in Alzheimer's research, meeting all your paranoid needs, children, fungal infections from this hospital. Good. And this is where I wanted to end. So the research on lectures, and these are traditional lectures where you can't stop and rewind and play again. The research on the utility of lectures for learning is not good. I like to treat my lectures more like preaching, like a sermon, high points, motivation, go get them. But in terms of transferring factual information from the lecturer to the student, they are not very useful. Why do I do it? Tradition, sing it with me. It's from a musical, Tradition. You can look it up. So this school is going lecture free, and part of what they're doing is interactive modules and stuff, and presumably some recordings of the type you're experiencing now. So I'm a huge believer in books, and you'll see that throughout the course. So I'm very comfortable with you having to learn a lot from books. Let me show you something from my childhood. So we're going to go, well, there's a link already to my homepage. And we will go to a course I taught last semester because I just found this musical this musical piece from Disney, Learning and Behavior. And you have to listen to this. I assume you'll be able to hear what comes through here. No! Oy vey. All right, something else is gone. But it's Jiminy Cricket from Disney, and Disney is very protective of copyrights. And it was about how useful books are for learning. And geez, do I believe in that. And I hope you agree that this is a good textbook and that there's lots to learn in there. Okay, so let's get to the book. So here's the homepage. We've already done the syllabus. There's the picture of the book. For me, I can log in here. You may have paper. So you will start there. And we'll go to the very beginning. Another song, a very good place to start. Do, re, mi. These authors and this publisher in general usually starts off with vignettes, little stories at the beginning of a chapter to try to capture your interest. And this is an interesting vignette, not classically psychopharmacology, but maggots, reducing infections from wounds. Maybe 10 years ago, there was kind of hysteria over flesh-eating bacteria. and a woman in Florida just died, and somebody else just got flesh-eating bacteria, I think, in Florida. And I was worried about my kids scraping their knees and getting flesh-eating bacteria, and I made sure that the pediatrician was familiar with the medical use of maggots. You get, medicinal maggots, which are, certified as being clean, and you put them on the wound, and they eat the bad and leave the good and promote healing. It's a really interesting story. Not one of the study questions. Okay, so there's a lot of terms in here. Now, if I were teaching my normal course, you would have to memorize these terms and answer in multiple choice format, but you're using the study guides. The Etter's papyrus, and my phone is blowing up. That can only be one person. I was excited that this might be a papyrus I'm very familiar with, but it's not. But it is an important papyrus. It's named after the Brit who bought it, I think. Yes, bought it in Luxor. And it's from 1550 BC. And I forget whether this is the one that's, yes, it's 110 pages, 20 meters long, and it is amazing. And it deals with lots of things, medicinal uses of herbs and spices and things. What I thought it might have been was this papyrus from, I think, 1600 BC, a little bit older. And why this one amuses me, is it has the first written reference to the brain, which I would have expected to be here. Surgery, wounds, yes. Well, trust me on that. I actually drew this because the graphics they had. There we go. So there's the first written reference to the brain, and I found it offensively ragged. So I made a new one using graphic software and then tried to give it to Wikipedia, but boy, are they paranoid about copyrights, and I'm not good with legal documents, and I gave up, but I have it still somewhere. That's it. That's the first written reference to the brain. And of course, in the course in psychopharmacology, that's quite important to us, even though the book is going to a different location. And there we go. Okay. So, pharmacology is broader than psychopharmacology. Neuropharmacology is, much, well, not much, but it involves psychopharmacology, but more at a cellular level. And I may mistakenly use that term occasionally because when I do my more advanced course, I do tend toward neuropharmacology than psychopharmacology. But these terms, drug action, drug effects, therapeutic effects, side effects, are all vital to understanding the drugs in general, and certainly psychopharmacology. Specific drug effects, one of my favorite drugs is Narcan, which is the trade name, naloxone, which is the generic name. I did decades of research using naloxone, Naloxone. That'll come up later, which is Narcan, Narcan, which the state of Pennsylvania was giving away recently to treat what I like to call opiate overdoses, IATE. Everybody now says opioid, even this book, but I'm a traditionalist. Opioids, I would say, are what are inside you, what you make, and opiates are things like morphine and heroin that you take from outside. Um, and I'll probably try to stick to that, although you're responsible for the book, and the book does use the term opioid the way many modern people do. So we have naloxone is an incredibly specific drug. Uh, you have to take so much of this to have non-specific effects that it's ridiculous. However, some drugs that are used therapeutically, their non-specific effects, which are often negative, their dose response functions overlap with the therapeutic response. So, and we'll be getting into the graphs relating to that in not too long. Notice that I've highlighted placebo. Placebo is not restricted to pain inhibition, but one of the reasons I did naloxone research for so long was I was a pain researcher. I studied descending brain to spinal cord, pain inhibitory systems. Placebo is very real, very real. And oddly, I'll try to find you a post on this. Even some people, even though they know they are getting the placebo, they get a placebo effect. It's not always you take a sugar pill and you think it's the real thing. So it's important, and it's not just pain. And there's possible mechanisms, and you can read that. Okay, these graphs in this chapter, I'm not going to test on them, but very often this publisher very effectively uses graphs to reinforce what's in the text. I will only test on what's in the text, but if, obviously if the text specifically refers to a feature of the figure, you'll have to know that too. So there's possible pathways for how a placebo could have a positive effect on behavior in our course, since we're doing psychopharmacology, but it doesn't have to be just that. They used to treat congestive heart failure by cracking people's chests open, sprinkling talcum powder on the exposed heart, and putting people back together. And they were so happy with that. They felt so much better. Once they finally did science on it, they found out it just didn't do much. Boxes you're responsible for. There's a discussion of naming drugs, so you can take a look at that. Okay, now there's a slightly scary figure and a slightly scary term, pharmacokinetic factors determining drug action. So the header on this is binding. And for psychopharmacology, usually the target site is a neuron receptor, and there it is, upper left blue. And blood plasma, which is the goopy stuff in your blood. Things move out of blood plasma to the receptor, from the receptor to blood plasma. And, blood runs everywhere. And one of the places it can go to is bone and fat and inactive storage. One of the reasons that some drugs, like marijuana, can be detected long after you've taken them is because of binding, primarily in fat, and they can still show up. Absorption, how the drug gets in, membrane to the oral cavity, GI system, peritoneum, which is your gut, muscles and lungs. And by gut, I mean the gut outside, uh, your small and large intestines. That's very important, and those are routes of administration are discussed in this chapter, and you'll have to understand them. And I know there are study questions based on that, and also there are study questions based on drug administration, oral, IV, blah 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 blah, lots of stuff there. And then the liver is and the stomach and pH and intestines. Those are all important factors. And the book will discuss first pass metabolism because when things are consumed orally, virtually always the blood goes right through the liver first. So if the liver can break down the drug, you're going to lose some of it there. And you got to get rid of it. And feces and urine are of interest because drugs that we give to humans and sadly to animals end up in the ecosystem. And we give most of our antibiotics in the United States to animals. And then they poop it, and bacteria evolve resistance to it, and we're going to pay a price for that. And excretion, yeah, okay. So that's an important and certainly useful figure. And routes of administration, so that just, again, as I said, the book very often uses the graphics to reinforce what's in the text. Biotransformation is important. For example, if you took heroin, by the time it gets to your receptors, it's not heroin, it's morphine. Biotransformation. So that's an important topic. And here are the routes of administration. And you've got to know them, and it's discussed. These are, and there's first pass metabolism, which I already referred to. Things going through the liver. Why isn't this working? Hey. Oh, I remember the trick. Maybe you don't. Anyway, first pass metabolism. Whoa, dude. This browser hangs up my machine sometimes. So we're just going to have to forget about trying to highlight things. Rectal IV. IV is very, very common in medical environments. And in another diagram that's a bit like the one we saw earlier. And there's routes of administration on the right, subcutaneous, intramuscular, intravenous are all important. I had to take an anticoagulant for a while, and I did a lot of subcutaneous. It's really easy to do. It's also very easy to do in animal research. And you have to look at all those things and learn that. Intraperitoneal IP. We don't do it much to people, but we use it in animal research. We used to use it, we still do, animal research quite a bit. You're putting it into the peritoneal cavity, which is the cavity around largely your intestines. If the needle inadvertently nicks an intestine or injects into an intestine, the drug, if it's in the intestine, the drug won't work that well. If you nick the intestine, you can get infections. So you have to know what you're doing here. Subcutaneous, I mentioned that. Inhalation, we often use that for animal surgery and certainly human surgery. It's why we like it is it's easy to modulate. And one of the riskiest thing about surgery, if you're being anesthetized, is the general anesthesia. So you have to be monitoring that quite a bit. Sublingual under the tongue. I take B12 that way. I don't do anything intranasally, but stuff gets into your body real fast there. But if you take some stuff, it blows holes in up there. Whew. CSF. Former President Ronald Reagan was shot, and they wanted to control his post-operative pain, but leave him mentally unclouded, and they administered opiates to the CSF around the spinal cord, and that can work pretty well. And sometimes when you're birthing babies, that's the way anesthetics are administered. Across the skin with patches. There's several things you can use there. Pain is what I used to do, and lidocaine patches can be useful for human pain. You just slap it on and it goes through the skin. And they mentioned that sometimes you can use an electric charge to encourage that. Epidural, so I've already alluded to that with childbirth. Intracranial is into the brain. Intracerebroventricular is into the ventricles of the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid. We have infusion pumps that can be implanted. They're very cool. Gene therapy is becoming more and more popular. Some of these things are going to be a little confusing in chapter 1, I must admit, because they're doing a very broad overview of how drugs are administered. I think you'll find if you read through the first 3 chapters, maybe 4 chapters, a lot of this stuff will be quite a bit more clear. Time course of blood level depends on route of administration, and oral, subcutaneous, intramuscular with oil, intravenous. So so it's amount in the blood on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. Psychoactive, that's what we're here for. You got to get the drug across membranes, even if you're taking it orally. And hopefully on the next page, nope. Yes, there's a picture, a scary picture, I must admit, of a cell membrane, and it is a which means bilipid layer, and the middle of this, the pink area of this, is fatty, and it is not amused by water-soluble things going through it. So you have water-loving blue balls on the outside and the inside, and water-hating red tangly things on the inside. And you got to get through that to get things into the body and sometimes into cells. Although a lot of the drugs we'll be dealing with, the receptors are on the outside of the cell. You're not going to be asked to memorize this table or spit it back, but if given that the book is open, how hard could it be? But again, that's a nice overview. Route of administration, advantages, disadvantages. If you want to talk good drugs, you should be fluent in that chapter. Lipid soluble. That's the thing. Can you get through cell membranes? And there's a discussion of concentration and ions, and the poster child here is aspirin, and the sort of magic that happens where aspirin in an acid environment penetrates cell membranes pretty well, and then it moves out of your stomach. But then when it gets in your blood, it's not so acid, so it doesn't go back. You just have to sit down with that. and try to come to grips with it. And if you feel it's a little confusing, you're right. And there's the figure that deals with that and aspirin. And I'll tell you that I do make my advanced students deal with this, and it can be challenging. But you'll have your book open that will definitely help. Drug redistribution. Okay. Now we're getting to something I know and love, the brain. Because for many psychoactive drugs, we want to get the drugs into the brain, but the brain has something that sounds singular, but it's really plural, the blood-brain barrier. Most organs in the body, except the brain, have gaps between their cell membranes so that many molecules don't have to go through a lipid membrane to get across those membranes because there are gaps. But with rare exceptions, the cells that form the brain's blood-brain barrier have tight junctions. And that means drugs have no option of just sneaking in straight. They have to go first across the bilipid layer that faces the bloodstream, and then they're inside a cell. Then they got to get outside the cell and into the brain. It's a trick. And some people who are getting treatment for brain cancer, they want to get the cancer-killing drug into the brain, but the brain is not amused. So they are developing tricks to temporarily pop open the blood-brain barrier, sneak in the anti-cancer treatment, and then the blood-brain barrier will come back. So this picture is a sagittal section. More specifically, it's a mid-sagittal section. You can see the blue, which is where the CSF lives. You have lateral ventricles, you have third ventricle, you have fourth ventricle. Good, they mentioned the aqueduct of Sylvius, but I refer to that as the cerebral aqueduct. And if you're familiar with Rome at all, aqueducts carry water. So CSF tends to flow from the lateral to the third, from the third to the aqueduct, through the aqueduct to the fourth, and then out around where it's reabsorbed. And here are the membranes surrounding the brain. The dura is well named. It's very tough. Right up next to it, excuse me, literally touching it, a little moisture there is the arachnoid layer. So those two are like right together. But then there's the subarachnoid space, which is between the arachnoid and the pia. The pia touches the central nervous system, which, by the way, is the brain and spinal cord. And inside the subarachnoid space, you have arteries and veins. And there was a movie, Arachnophobia, spider webs. So the early neuroanatomists saw all these little fibers in here, and they thought it sort of looked like a spider web, and thus the term. So it's important to become comfortable with that anatomy. So when we're talking, and this is what I mentioned already. So here are capillaries that are typical, where you've got gaps and things can go right through, but that's not true for the brain. We have tight junctions. I've colored. All right, let me stay on the left side. So astrocytes or astroglia, very important to the functioning of the brain. Glial cells in general are very important to the functioning of the brain. Pay attention to glial cells. They're going to become more and more important. On the right side, I highlighted that term, area postrema. It's an area. It's postrema, which means posterior, toward the back. It's in the back part of the brain. That is actually where you vomit. So that has a kind of leaky blood-brain barrier, and it's sort of snacking on what your blood is delivering to try to determine whether your blood is delivering toxic things. And Alcohol vomiting, erythema. Uh, it amuses me. I like the term erythema. Placenta, yep. Depot binding, and I sort of referred to places where drugs can go and just hang out, like your fat and your bones. So that's a nice discussion there that goes on for more than a bit. Um, so if you have rapid depot binding, that's going to slow down uh, the delivery initial impact of the drug. And sometimes, if it takes a while for like days for a drug to work, you're actually filling up the depots, which are hard to do, uh, to get an adequate circulating level of the drug to get a good drug effect. Um, so here's biotransformation. I referred to that a bit earlier. Drug clearance, different kind of kinetics. Half life is very important for drugs, and half life is half life. Um, Table 1.5, notice I've highlighted fluoxetine, which is Prozac. If you look at the half-life of, say, cocaine, the top one, half-life of 0.5 to 1.5 hours. Look at the half-life of Prozac, fluoxetine, 7 to 9 days. Whoa, you miss a dose of Prozac, that's not a really big deal. But if you're like the number two drug, morphine, half life of 1.5 to 2 hours, they forget to give you your morphine, you're going to know it. And if you're a smoker, you've probably been able to figure out what the half life is, sort of nicotine. And there's clearance across half life. Here's steady state, which I sort of alluded to with the binding. So you're increasing doses and you get little humps and humps and humps, but the serum level eventually gets to a stable amount. This requires professional monitoring or well-established drug regimens to get you up to the stable. You can't just whack the person with a ton of drug. You have to kind of sneak up on it a bit. Different kinds of kinetics, biotransformation by the liver. Liver is very good for us, but it may be fighting with our drugs. And I mentioned that some things work because they turn into something else, and there's some of that there uh, in table 1.6, phase one and phase two. So sometimes you want a metabolite, not the original drug. Then there's a lot of details. And now we're into genes. Geez. Remember, this is an open book test. Stay calm. I don't think it gets worse than this chapter. It's not kind and gentle. And remember, you don't take this quiz until like the third day. And after this quiz, you'll be a semi-pro. Drug monitoring. There's a tragic story of an elephant. I do remember that story. Um, we do a lot of research on rodents, but we are not rodents. And we have to be very aware that some things translate well from one species to another and some things don't. So we're done with this section. And okay, it's pharmacodynamics. This is important. And there's drug categories, which you'll have to know. And as we go through the course, they will become more and more familiar to you. Ligand. That's a very important term. Any molecule that binds with a receptor. So, here's the bilipid membrane, not as graphically indicated. This is a transmembrane protein complex. Transmembrane means it goes across the membrane. So the drug usually hits the outside, and the receptor complex notices it and sometimes causes changes on the inside. Occasionally, the like steroid hormones, they actually penetrate the bilipid layer of the cell, and then they hit receptors inside. And oh man, do they do things! When you look at the effect of a drug and it goes inside the nucleus and starts messing with your DNA, you've got some serious action there. This is classic agonist and antagonist. Both of them dock in the receptor complex, but when the agonist docks, it mimics the effect of the neurotransmitter, which could be inhibitory, by the way. It just mimics it. The antagonist also docks, but it does not cause the protein complex to change. So if you've got an antagonist in the receptor and you are hit with more drug or neurotransmitter, the neurotransmitter can't get in, and therefore it disrupts the effect of the neurotransmitter. Naloxone, Narcan, this is how that works. It has a very, very high affinity for certain types of opioid receptors, and I have a video somewhere lost in space where I gave naloxone to an animal that had not a lethal overdose of morphine, but a high dose of morphine. 15 seconds, that animal was back, and it was subcutaneous. Up and down regulation. The nervous system is aware of its environment. Every cell is aware of its environment, and the cell can decide to grow more or fewer receptors. And if it grows more receptors, you'll get more sensitive to drugs. And if it grows less receptors, you'll get less sensitive to drugs. That figure overviews like 2 pages worth of text. Dose response curves are very important. And there we go. That's an ogive. So it's an ogival function. And you probably haven't had statistics, but if you have had statistics, I'm not finding a good ogive, but an ogive is simply a normal curve. See the beginning of the function and then very steep, and you keep accumulating. And then you get the flip side where you keep going up fast and then you slow down. So an ogive is simply an accumulated normal curve. And, there's the response 50%, often referred to as ED50. This is important. Notice that hydromorphone and morphine, their curves are very similar. But morphine is shifted to the right from hydromorphone. So you need more of it. But you can look at the shape and say, it looks like the same thing, it's just been dialed to the right. And when you look at codeine, it's dialed even further to the right, but notice the shape is the same. This is one indication that all 3 of these drugs are working on one receptor complex. Notice aspirin. You can't look at aspirin and think it's the same as these functions over here. Aspirin is producing its effect by a very different mechanism. And that's basically, how you interpret drug response functions. And here's a nice discussion again with ogives of effects on what you want, decreased anxiety, but then you get increased sedation. So these two dose response functions, one is a therapeutic effect, one is a side effect. They're annoyingly close together. And respiratory depression, which means you die, mercifully, that's pretty far over. But not always. And there's a discussion of therapeutic index, which deals with the EDs, ED50s, and side effect 50. Non-competitive, okay. So here's a competitive antagonist, which may actually be my beloved naloxone. It is. Notice it has just moved the blue line to the right, and the shape is the same. It is competing for the very same receptor site as opioids or morphine. However, over here, this non-competitive antagonist is antagonizing, but geez, the function is very different. So yes, it's an antagonist, but it's not working at the same receptor site as the book will discuss. And now this whole discussion of tolerance, which is a big effect. And unfortunately, with some drugs, the therapeutic effects can show tolerance, but the like respiratory depression may not. And it becomes trickier and trickier to give drugs that don't kill you as you take the drug for several weeks or months. Nice discussion. There's different kinds of tolerance. Metabolic tolerance, how you metabolize the drug. Receptor up and down regulation is another one. And then there's a long discussion of behavioral tolerance. And you haven't had fundamentals, but this is classical conditioning, Bell meat powder. And the body is not stupid. You tell the body you're about to be hit with the drug, and you may love the drug, but the body wants you to stay the same. And it may learn to work against the drug, even though you're paying good money for it. And there's a nice discussion of that there. And there we go. So, classical cognition model of addiction. By the way, if you're in love with someone, that's a very relevant discussion because love is a physical addiction. I wish I could give you that lecture. And this is a nice Siegel. So he got a science article out of this while I was in graduate school. And those data are pretty compelling. State-dependent learning. No drug, good, drug, good. And then you mix it up and not so good. By the way, your emotional state is a state-dependent phenomenon. So if you insist on studying calmly with no stress and no real testing of yourself, and then you're in an environment where you're taking a test that's timed and your stress levels go up, you're going to be, no drug during learning, and you're going to be stressed during testing, and that will harm your performance. So try to self-test. And there's a discussion of sensitization, which can be upregulation. And oh boy, my mother used to become crazy on morphine, but not me. Genotype, sex can make big differences in how drugs affect people. And in the future, we're going to get our genomes read as part of standard medical practice. And they should be able to deliver much better doses, and even drugs in the future. And I am done with the chapter. Oh my God, I know I rushed it, but you get to stop and replay it, and you have the textbook. So there's only 16 study questions for this. Let's just read them because that's fun. I have a timer going here. It should go off at an hour. What is the placebo effect? Discuss several possible, several possible explanations. How might it be used clinically and in research? What are the principal pharmacokinetic factors? Explain how they determine bioavailability. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of several methods of administering drugs. Got to know those and use the technical terms. Describe the factors that influence the absorption of lipid soluble and ionized drugs. What is the blood-brain barrier? I'm very into that, particularly since this is psychopharmacology. What is depot binding? Discuss 3 ways it can alter magnitude and duration of drug. We saw that. Compare and contrast synthetic and non-synthetic biotransformations. Why are these metabolic changes to the drug molecule necessary for excretion? What are the factors that modify biotransformation? What is a receptor? Several characteristics that are common among receptors. Define agonist, antagonist, partial agonist, and inverse agonist as they relate to drug receptor. What is the dose response curve? And I like the word ogive, and it's really a normal distribution accumulated. How does the curve show threshold response ED50 and maximum response? Draw a curve, which may be a little difficult for me to do here. Possibly you'll draw it on a piece of paper and take a photo. What is the difference between potency and efficacy? How is it shown graphically? What is the therapeutic index? Why is it important? Not only important, it's vital for therapeutic drugs. What does a competitive antagonist have on drug effects? Compare its effect on potency and efficacy. And remember my good friend naloxone. Drug tolerance, 3 types of tolerance or mechanisms. Compare tolerance and sensitization. Describe pharmacogenetics and its role in personalized medicine. Give 1 example of its potential use in clinical treatments. I don't think it gets any worse than this. These are all new terms. Some of them will be explained better in future chapters, but you have the questions. There are only 16. I think we're doing them Wednesday or Thursday. I'll have to check the syllabus. If you have questions on the questions, use the discussion board. It's not that I don't want to talk to you. I do, but I want everyone to be on a level playing field. So thanks for your attention. I hope that helped at least a little bit.